Greetings and salutations. This is Abdelhadi with The Bitter Truth, where we may not have all the answers, but we're going to ask an awful lot of questions. As always, you can become a bitter pill, spoonful of sugar, the medicine going down on patreon.com/The Bitter Truth. You can also listen to the show on iTunes, Podcast Addict, pretty much anything you listen to, Spotify, name it, we're on everything. So, guest returning for further conversation on our greatest hits. Nothing like a nice lounge act of the greatest hits of war, blood, murder. So Chris Ward, Vets for Peace, veteran, knows his stuff. We left off kind of at the beginnings of Vietnam. Let's just jump right into the Gulf of Tonkin, which is kind of, I won't say the original WMDs because this country's had plenty of them, but that was a pretty bold one. Mm-hmm. So what was the genesis of that?
Of the weapons of mass destruction?
No, the Gulf of Tonkin. I'm sorry.
Oh, Gulf of Tonkin. Of Tonkin. Okay, so yeah, sorry.
I just said it was the original, but it wasn't the original. I'm sorry.
No, so again, as we had talked about in the last episode, where as we try to get involved in a conflict, there's economic interests involved in getting into some sort of a conflict. Americans are like, no, we don't need to get involved in that. And then magically some event manifests to that we can say, look, they're attacking us. And that's how they did. But except for the fact that they really hadn't at this point.
Right.
And so they're like, well, how do we get the U.S. involved in Vietnam? As I had mentioned in the last episode, Ho Chi Minh was actually a fan of the United States.
Right.
So he wasn't going to attack us just because he hated Western ideology. That was a good argument that we used in the Middle East, that they're like, they hate Western way of life. They hate our ideology.
They hate our freedoms.
They hate our freedom, And so that was a really good, propaganda tool to get us to, hate Muslims and invade the Middle East.
Right.
Which, again, like you and I know, it's not true. I have a lot of Muslim friends of mine from the Middle East that love Western culture. So
yeah,
it wasn't. I was like, okay.
My cousins specifically.
Yeah. You found like
they come here. They chase skirts, they drink. Yeah. I've had a couple of cousins die of consumption, as they used to call it back in the old days.
Oh, damn.
Yeah, one guy had a blow problem. The other guy had just drank himself to death. And cool guys, too. They just came here. It was like a dog with a taste for blood, man. They went hog wild.
Right.
But with the Gulf of Tonkin, though, that was the thing to drag us into a war that no one really had a stomach for. No one knew where Vietnam was.
Right.
And if you look at that on a map, it's so tiny. Were they again trying to foment the whole China's trying to get into,
they use that. Yeah, they use the expansion of communism as, again, we were still butthurt because we had lost Korea.
Right.
So they're like, well, we have to get involved in Vietnam, but we didn't have anything really to prompt Americans. So the CIA created the Gulf of Tonkin incident. So, but they went to as far as to have radio communications saying that the Vietnamese U-boats had actually attacked a naval ship, and they had people yelling, people jumping over the side of the boat into the water. Like, it was a whole fiasco. So they're doing this like, we're being attacked, we're being torpedoed, and they're yelling into the microphone as if it was really happening.
Right.
And General at the time, Secretary of Defense McNamara, later on confessed, I think in the 1990s, even though we kind of already knew it, is that absolutely it was a false flag operation to get in, and I love McNamara's, when you want to talk about one of the I think underwritten characters that all Americans should understand, his role of working for the Ford Motor Company.
Right.
Going on to be a Secretary of Defense, and going on to be the president of the World Bank.
Right.
And then working in the CIA.
And real quick side note, Johnson put him in that position because he was afraid that McNamara was going to end up like James Forrestal, who was the first Secretary of Defense after they quit calling it the War Department.
Right.
And he lost his mind. He jumped out of a hospital window. Yeah. Right. And ghosts were chasing him, and he's running. He got caught a couple times running naked. That commies were chasing him and shit. And so McNamara was about to crack by 66, 67. The World Bank job was a nice way of Johnson just, I don't want another McNamara or another Forrestal. Let's just get this guy out of here. Is that pretty accurate?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
And that's a lot of these people is that they always know that they can lean towards there's an imminent threat against your life. So you could end up taking a nosedive out a window.
Right.
And you're economically never going to have to worry again.
Right.
Like till death do us part, you're going to be fine. I mean, I can't remember how long he was president of World Bank. I mean, it had
a lot of years, like up through the late 70s, because he was financing deals. He was getting money for Carter.
Yeah.
Development money for Nicaragua and Guatemala. He was still involved in all that shit.
Right.
But so with the Gulf of Tonkin, how fast did the American public's appetite for war grow after that happened? Did they push it pretty quick?
Immediately.
Yeah.
So they were talking about first. They were like, well, what are we going to do as far as a contribution of U.S. military support to the Vietnam conflict? Well, they underweighed what it was going to take because we couldn't move troops there fast enough.
Okay.
And so they thought because we're the greatest army on the planet, a lot of these soldiers are, carrying pitchforks, and maybe 1 out of 5 is carrying an AK-47. So this will be a really easy conflict for us to fight. Two things challenged with that. For one, we'd always been in trench warfare up to this point, including Korea. Mm-hmm. So they weren't accustomed to the now, what would be your, what do they call it? There's a special term for it, where even in the villages, so people that are not wearing uniforms are combatants. So we get into this whole new way of fighting where anybody can be a combatant. Mm-hmm. And then as opposed to trench warfare, now we're having to fight a new system of these tunnels that they had dug through the mountains that they had used when they had actually defended against the French, which we're like, we don't even know how to fight like this, where there's no front line. We're just going to perpetually move around in circles until we find all the enemies. So I think massive war crimes. I mean, one of the greatest
My Lai
massacres. Yeah.
My Lai, yeah.
Yeah, the My Lai massacre that's taken place there. And it was, sad that, the whistleblower, or the soldier that stepped up in that nobody actually, I think, what, did one person serve in prison?
One guy got it. One guy was indicted. He was convicted, and then Nixon pardoned him. They called it a partial pardon, but he was in jail for about a year. But from the top down, he was the only guy that got indicted. He's the only guy that saw trial, got convicted. Fine, he should have, but so should his brass. So should have the guys that did it. He wasn't doing it by himself.
No, all the soldiers involved. Yeah.
Yeah, and so we got our asses handed to us in Vietnam. Mm-hmm. And, it cracks me up about the American people. The last 20 years, we've been getting our asses handed to us Vietnam style for about 20 years now. We're not winning anything. We didn't win Iraq. No. We didn't win Syria. We did not win Libya. Clusterfuck of a fuck. We'll get into that in a second. But so the next big, we got to get our honor back was Grenada, right? We just had a car bomb kill a couple hundred Marines. Mm-hmm. And Reagan's big answer to losing Marines in Lebanon is to fight the threat of communism in Grenada, because it's going to be like Cuba. And Grenada's population of about what I think was like 12,000 people.
Probably.
Yeah, it was like the country of Guadalupe or something, or the Santa Lupe. It was like there's no. So what the fuck? How did the American people get talked into goddamn Grenada? And they kept the press out. They
didn't get talked into Grenada. It was one of the sad. So it's easy to, when you talk about the guerrillas being, in different countries, because now we can say, we've got enemies on different fronts. The communists have now invaded Grenada, where, we could scatter that all over, when we talk about South America and all the crimes, of us invading countries in South America, to go after these small pockets of communists, mm-hmm. and so on and so forth. But that was one of the greatest challenges. We needed a win. We needed somebody that say American defeated communism. But I find it laughable because when we look at the military might of the Taliban, when you look at the military might of, Cuba, and you're talking about, we have the highest, we're the number one, we have the highest defense budget on the planet. We don't have the largest military force, but we have the most technological military force.
Sure.
And yet you're losing in fights against Afghanistan,
Yeah.
Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
What would happen if we? That's why I always find when people say they try to push for us to get into a conflict with Iran. I'm like, Iran has one of the top, like, I think 14th or 15th greatest military force on the planet. You know, plus, as opposed to Iraq, look at the landmass of Iran.
Right. Which people do not do.
No, nobody looks at any of the military. They have more boats in the water. Yes, they are all small boats. They're all small fighting boats, but they have a lot more boats in the water than we do, you know. And so if we're losing our asses against these small countries, I kept asking myself, I'm like, what would happen if we got in a fight with a large country?
Right.
So when people say, well, China is going to attack us, there's always this red threat that China is going to conquer America. We're all going to be speaking Chinese one day. I'm like, it's never going to happen.
Yeah.
For one, our two economies are so intertwined.
Right. Right.
That if for one to attack the other would be, the whole, cutting off your nose to smite your face.
Well, we just steamed, not to get too ahead of the curve here, because I want to talk about a couple of things, but we just steamed a few months back, and they're still there. We just steamed about, I don't know how many battleships from Guam, 2,000 miles away, into the South China Sea.
Yeah.
Because a couple of years back, China discovered oil and natural gas. Yeah. And for the last year and a half or so, they've been pumping like 2,000 barrels a day of oil and like 15 million cubic feet of natural gas every day. Didn't have to invade anybody. Didn't have to go to anybody else's country to get it. They didn't go to India, right? It was, oh, hey, it's our sea. Hey, these are our borders, and nobody blinks. Like, oh, will you side with China? If China had a PT boat in the Gulf of Mexico, we'd lose our fucking mind.
Oh, yeah.
So,
even though China has already bought up more real estate than any foreign power on the planet.
Right. We're going to be taken over, but it's not going to be with a gun. It's going to be with corporations and
absolutely
and Carlyle Group type Saudi conglomerations that, you're going to see one day you go to Mount Rushmore at the bottom of your ticket on the lower right-hand side, it's going to say Dubai Inc. Or like it's going to say Taipei LLC when you go to the Grand Canyon, and you're not even going to know. Like, you're not even going to know. It's like you're just going to think, oh, there's a company called Taipei. How interesting. Like, no one's going to even know. But so out of Grenada, clusterfuck, Panama, full on war crime. We invade a country the size of Austin, Texas.
Yep.
Kill like 6,000 people. We arrest Noriega. Yep. This is decidedly American, by the way. We arrest a president, try him in Miami, dies of cancer in jail. But he was our boy. He was on the CIA payroll since the 60s.
Yeah. So
what happened in Panama? How did Bush justify fucking Panama?
There's no way to justify it. Okay. It always goes back to the same is that we use it. There's a communist regime there that's mistreating the local nationals. And we always use it as a human rights, every invasion we've done. We've always said, that people are being mistreated there by their locals. That's how we were able to justify. They were like, under Saddam's regime, he killed, 2 million people, and then we go in there and kill 25 million.
Sure.
So we always use that like it's a human rights issue, which I felt like we justified going into Bosnia. But in cases like Panama and so on and so forth, whenever we were trying to pull that trick in recently in Venezuela,
right?
We were like, "Oh, look what the government's doing to the people," and this and that. I'm like, "Oh, yeah, but."
Well, and that's the thing is rule one in regime change. You got to get the army.
Yeah.
If you don't get the army, it's not going to work. The Bolsheviks got the army. Yeah. The French got the army. Right? The Indians got the army. Like you get the army, you will have a successful. That's what happened in Bolivia.
Yeah,
we got the army.
Batista was a military.
Yeah, that's right. Batista, Castro, he got the army. It's like as soon as the army goes, fuck this, and they turn the guns back on the guy.
Yeah,
it's over. But then Bush tried to, because he did get critic. He did get shit for it. The UN was all over his ass. But then he tries to justify himself in Iraq. And we're talking about Bush 41 now, not his son.
Yeah. So 1990, yeah, when we invaded that was another thing where we argued because we said they invaded the sovereign nation of Kuwait. And we're like, and this is what the Iraqi people are doing to the Kuwaitis. And so we use that as our justification to go into war in 1990 against Saddam, who was our man.
For 8 years.
who wasn't playing house anymore.
Right.
So they're like, we need to overthrow Saddam and we need to get him out of there, and we need to, install a new puppet master, that somebody we can control in the Middle East because of Iraqi oil.
Well, see, but then the way that whole thing got started was he asked for permission from the American ambassador to Iraq. April Glaspie gave him permission without checking with state, without checking with the White House. She said, we don't have an opinion on Arab conflict. Just don't fuck with Israel. Mm-hmm. And he's like, okay, because for the 8 years he was fighting Iran, he discovered that Kuwait was cross-drilling into Iraq and stealing his oil. And he said, hey, you guys better quit it. And he said, well, we're not going to quit it. And he goes, well, you better. And he goes, well, we're not. And he goes, and then Kuwait's like, we got friends in America. He's like, I don't know if you've noticed. I do too. And so he goes to April Glaspie. She says, because he was crazy, but he wasn't stupid. Yeah. So he goes rolling right into Kuwait. And that's why Bush gave him 2 months to get out, because he knew it was a mistake.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so then, but then we made it sound like this big glory win to vindicate ourselves from Vietnam. It didn't feel that way though, did it?
No, not at all. And that's kind of the joke is that we talk about how we won that first. I mean, for one, the conflict was less than a year. It was the most cakewalk war that you could ever imagine in history.
Right.
Because the Iraqis, for one, underfunded, underarmed, underfed in a lot of cases. Mm-hmm. I mean, you would have like thousands of Iraqi troops that would give up to a squad size element. Like you'd see one tank roll over the hill and then 1,000 Iraqis there with their hands in the air.
Right.
And so we pushed them out of Kuwait. And then what? We created a permanent military position in Kuwait. Mm-hmm. And we're still out today.
And Saudi Arabia.
And Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, because that was the excuse we used to get into Mecca and Medina, because, what's his face? Not Faisal, but not Faoud, but the other guy, the spokesperson, the kid that before, he's the old version of Prince Salman Lama Ding Dong, whatever his fucking name is. But he's the guy who got talked into, hey, listen, if you don't want this to happen again, and if Israel decides to get tough, hey, we got bases here, we'll cover your ass, da 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 da. And so that was it. But then we imposed sanctions on Iraq for the next 8 or 9 years.
Yeah.
Before we go back in there again.
Right.
And Afghanistan, there was never any proof that the Taliban government had anything to do with Osama bin Laden. Yeah, he was hiding out in Afghanistan. But zero. But they sold the American people on that, right? And then Iraq, a couple of years later, same thing, WMDs, and then they never found them.
Yeah.
And
so our push to put and I think that's where a lot of Americans have a challenge with understanding what the Al-Qaeda was. So the Al-Qaeda was never an organization.
Right.
This is the challenge we have, because anytime we think of an organization, our heads immediately have an organizational chart. There's somebody in charge, there's their commanders or their captains or whatever, and then you get, there's greater number of, unit commanders, and then we have their foot soldiers.
Right.
The Al-Qaeda was just a list of people. It wasn't ever an organization. Right. And who it was who the United States recruited to develop the fighters against the Russians.
In Afghanistan,
Al-Qaeda literally translates to the base.
Right.
Is all it means.
Right.
And so there was never an organization, and where every time we use it as propaganda, I used it in intelligence. Anytime I wanted the American government to look at something, I'd have to put so-and-so with ties to Al-Qaeda. Mm-hmm. Well, the tie may be 6 degrees of separation.
Right.
I could literally write a report about anybody and say, Chris Ward with ties to Al-Qaeda, because I can do 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon all the way back to some terrorist that fought in the Taliban against the Russians. And
right.
That way they're like, ooh, because the American people just loved seeing something about Al-Qaeda in the news.
Right.
So we put it in everything, so the Americans would be like, oh my God, the Al-Qaeda was involved.
Right.
Like, no, not really.
Well, I mean, it's
no more than Ronald McDonald was involved.
Right. And then, I kind of jumped ahead a little bit because you were there. So I did want to talk to you about the Serb-Croat thing and, Bosnia, because that doesn't get a lot of coverage, and at the time it kind of didn't get a lot of coverage. You saw it on the news. It was like right before sports. It was rarely the headline. Why is that? And I think we were pushed into that, and because Bill Clinton was a moral coward. But what was the start of that thing, and why did we end up, because the UN troops were there at first before we got in, right?
Yeah. The UN actually overwatched all the war crimes.
Oh.
The big war crimes. There were UNIs watching, physically sitting there watching war crimes. Like you look at the city of Srebrenica.
Okay.
We created it as a UN enclave. It was supposed to be a little safety bubble for the Muslims to be able to escape to. And the United Nations like, hey, we've cordoned off this city. This is going to be a safe zone, so nobody can fight here. But the rule is you have to turn in all your weapons before you come into the city. So they're like, sure, absolutely. And they had all of, I can't remember the exact number. It was like 16 UN officials there, maybe.
Wow.
That would be a big number from what I'm actually thinking. But
sure,
the Bosnian Muslim troop or individuals, these weren't fighters. These were just farmers with guns. So they came in, they put all their weapons in the truck, in the UN trucks, and they're like, okay, we're safe. Thank God, the UN is here to protect us. Well, as soon as the Serbs found out, Ratko Mladic, who was the general of the Serbian forces at the time, surrounds the city. And they're just like looming over them. Basically, like, United Nations, get out. You have like so many days before we just attack anyway. Like, what are you going to do? So the UN calls ahead to Brussels, and they're like, we got the enemy at the gates. Like, the Serbs have surrounded us on the hilltop. We're all in the city here. What do we do?
Right.
And the order from Brussels was, it's not our job to intervene. We're just here to watch. And they watched as thousands of Bosnian Muslims got murdered in the course of a week.
Wow.
The women were raped or murdered. The children, if they were little boys or men, they were killed immediately. And they were buried. Significant mass grave sites with thousands of victims still in Srebrenica today. Football field size mass grave sites.
Wow.
I think they're still exhuming bodies. The UN watched that.
Yeah, they just, and then what? So how did our involvement come about? Did the UN finally just say, "Hey, we can't shoot at anybody"? Is it that simple, or what happened?
So if you remember, I'm trying to remember. I want to say it was the end of World War II was when the United States became a part of, and basically has been running the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
Right.
So NATO. Well, a part of that world policing action is that anytime there's a situation of genocide, this is where it becomes historically important, is that we're to intervene in case there's genocide.
Okay.
Well, they didn't want, so U.S. at the time, the government didn't want to dedicate any weapons because they were like, it's a skirmish. It's just people are getting killed, but Bosnia is the size of Ohio. So like, well, we don't want to dedicate any U.S. forces to this. So when those reports started coming to the United States about genocide, they literally scratched out the word genocide and came up with this new term called ethnic cleansing. Well, ethnic cleansing wasn't anywhere on our rules of engagement as far as NATO is concerned.
Right. Specifically genocide.
Yeah. So they're like, well, ethnic cleansing isn't even a thing. So this doesn't, we don't need to get involved. It's just ethnic cleansing.
Wow.
It sounds nice, but we're going to stay out of it. And the same thing, as I mentioned in the last episode, Warren Christopher, I'll remember the interview where he's like, this is Europe's problem, not ours.
Wow.
And I was like, immediately, that's World War II. That's what he said against the Nazis.
Right.
During Hitler's rise to power. Not right. He didn't say that. But that's what American, that's what Americans were basically saying. Like, we don't need to get involved. Well, the challenge came was when journalists, all of a sudden over time, they were sending pictures from the war, and it wasn't that big of a deal. But then journalists started catching the concentration camps. So they saw the Serbs had set up these concentration camps with Croats and Muslims. And then you see all these skin and bones standing behind fences, starving to death. And immediately flashbacks came from Nazi
Holocaust. Yeah.
Holocaust.
Yeah. And
Americans are like, there's concentration camps in the 1990s
in Europe. Yeah.
In Europe. Because they couldn't differentiate, so they just saw white people standing behind fences in skin, wrapped in skin, with no meat on their bones, naked.
Right.
And Americans are like, oh hell no, we got to get involved.
Right.
So and this was like Bill Clinton, why he became like the hero of Bosnia. It was in November of 95, NATO forces, predominantly led by the United States, we invaded Bosnia by way of Croatia. You know? And we already had troops on the ground. So what we had done to intervene prior to that without getting U.S. troops involved was we wanted to offset the war against the Serbs, because the Serbs, like you said earlier, whoever controls the army controls the nation building.
Right.
Well, the Serbs were 80% of the military, of the Yugoslav army. You get into like Croatia and the Muslims, they're like farmers and artisans and musicians. Like, they're not picking up. The only rifle they're picking up is so they can go hunting. Like,
right.
These weren't fighters. Well, when 80% of the Yugoslav army, the army you're depending on, all of a sudden turns on you, you're like, oh shit.
Yeah.
So what we did beforehand was we actually, this is where the Taliban connection gets in. We actually sent 6,000 Mujahideen fighters. So these are former Al-Qaeda guys, the Taliban.
Right.
These are the guys we used against Russia. Now we're shipping them in through airplanes, and we agreement with Franjo Tudjman of Croatia to fly them through Croatia into Bosnia to offset the war against the Serbs. And these are all Middle Easterners. They're from Qatar, they're from Saudi Arabia, all the Middle Eastern countries.
Wow.
So you want to talk about the shock and awe, because these are all a bunch of white people. I mean, there was no person of color living in Yugoslavia at the time.
That's right.
Not one.
That's right.
So now all of a sudden, even the Muslim fighters, because I've talked to them with generals about this. They're like, here we are, we have the Muslim fighters fighting against the Serbs. Now they ship in 6,000 Mujahideen fighters. These guys came in with beards, shaved heads, carrying machetes, with just the look of death in their eyes. And it scared the Bosnian Muslims.
Right.
They're like, what the shit is this?
Yeah.
And they took off. You want to talk about war crimes? I mean, they leveled the playing field. I mean, they pushed the Serbs back, because the Serbs didn't know. The Serbs weren't accustomed to that style of fighting.
Right.
Because these guys are using I call it they call it the tactics of the crescent moon. So the fighting styles from the Middle East. Mm-hmm. They're coming into a knife or a fight with rifles, using machetes and chopping off people's heads, and just slaughtering them. And so the Serbs were like, holy shit. So now we've got this. Now we've kind of leveled the playing field a little bit. But we had to stop the war, because it was like, this is getting out of hand, because now all three sides are committing war crimes.
Right.
Croats are they had Croatian units that were killing other Croatian units. We had Muslims killing Muslims. We had Serbs killing Serbs. Like, it was just because 5 years the war had passed.
Right.
So they said, okay, well, how are we going to draw this in? We rolled 50,000 troops into Yugoslavia in November of 1995, and that war came to a screeching halt.
Wow.
It died immediately, because they were like, we don't have the power to do this. White people aren't as they're not as easy to take a bullet as for a cause.
Right.
But we're starving. They were already out of food.
Right.
They were out of support. They had no financial support. They were out of bullets. They were literally fighting with pitchforks by this point. So they were like, we stopped. And so we moved in, and NATO took over in November of 95, and we ran stabilization forces there from 95 up until 2005, when we handed over responsibility of Bosnia to the European Union.
Wow. Okay, so on that note, though, we didn't get lied into anything like we had in previous excursions. That we reacted to what was actually happening.
Right.
And had Clinton moved faster, we probably wouldn't have seen so many deaths, right?
Right. But even then, there were still problems with this. So we still had the Serbs didn't want us there, of course, in the first place, because they had that power vacuum. So after Josip Broz Tito died, he kind of created this power vacuum, because here's a communist dictator, but he's a friendly one. So he's borrowing money from the United States. He's borrowing money from Russia, creating this false economy. So people only had to work like 3 to 4 hours a day. Mothers got 2 years of maternity leave.
Shit.
Everybody's, living their best life. They got like 2 months vacation a year,
Right.
And so that time in Yugoslav history, people think is like the golden era of Yugoslavia, but it was a false economy.
Right.
The people didn't know. And Tito was such, his ego was such. I mean, he has paintings and
statues
everywhere.
Right.
That he was so bold as to think like nothing could ever happen. So he didn't have a succession plan. So when he died, all of a sudden, all the extremists, Franjo Tudjman, Alija Izetbegovic from Bosnia, Slobodan Milosevic, from the three different ethnicities, they were already extremists. Like 2 or 3 of them had already spent time in prison for extremism under Tito's age.
Right.
And so here now, this is America's psycho decision, is that when we drew the line and we were saying, okay, now we're at peace in Bosnia. They took those 3 extremists, brought them to Dayton, Ohio, to sign the Dayton Peace Accords. It took days because you couldn't, of course, get all these 3 to agree on where were we going to draw our new lines. And it's funny using 3 war criminals to draw lines as to who's going to divide up the country. And it wasn't until, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but he got everybody drunk one night. He's like, this is how we're going to do this. So he goes out, gets like some brandy, gets everybody shitty, and they're like, screw it, let's just sign. And I think it was Ashcroft, maybe. No, it wasn't Ashcroft. No, that
was before his time. Ashcroft was.
It wasn't John Ashcroft.
Yeah.
But the guy he's dead. He's since died of. I don't know what he died of. But.
Well, Madeleine Albright took his place. You talking about Secretary of State?
No, this wasn't a Secretary of State at the time. Not the guy that. I'll look. I have to.
Yeah, that's cool.
I can't remember the guy's name, but it was amazing to me that they got the war criminals to do that, and we drew the dividing lines. Kind of like Britain did with India. After the independence in 1945.
Sure.
Which would end up being its own debacle in and of itself. But I always ask, why didn't that happen in Rwanda? We had UN oversight over Rwanda. In the civil war there, that was bloody genocide.
Yeah, genocide, flat out.
And no Americans intervened. And I have to believe it's because in Bosnia, they were white people.
Oh, 100%. I 100% believe that.
Have they been dark-skinned Muslims? Have they been Middle Eastern Muslims?
No. Now look what we're doing in Yemen. We're going to start wrapping up here in a little bit, and the rest should be self-explanatory. We get into the most recent, Syria, Libya. Syria was bullshit because that's because we were mad because Assad did not want to have a pipeline run from Dubai and Saudi Arabia in through because he's buddies with the Russians, and so we've been bombing the shit out of them for 10 years. And by the way, Assad won that civil war.
Yeah.
By the way, he does have control of the country, even though we keep bombing them. Libya, we made up lies of rape squads on Viagra.
Yeah.
And I mean,
the lies that were perpetuated, they sent in investigators that found no evidence of Assad using chemical weapons on the villagers.
Right. 3 times, but that's been debunked. 3 of those have been debunked. Debunked.
Yeah.
Under Obama and under Trump, debunked.
And the United Nations sent people in to investigate.
Right.
Which if anybody's going to be like, yeah, they're messing up over here, UN won't do anything, but they'll say something. They might say something.
Right.
And it was just sad. So I sent a message because of what happened in Vietnam against McNamara, Barack Obama had stated that the reason why we knew that not that there was any physical evidence, but they had intercepted a telephone communication from a general inside Assad's military that ordered chemical weapons to be used against these villagers. And I immediately wrote Barack Obama. Of course, that's just a one-way note. But I said, listen, a radio or a telephone intercept is not evidence of a crime.
That's right.
Because of Vietnam. That was a radio intercept that the CIA perpetuated to get us involved. And the reason being, because all you got to do is look at who makes money.
Mm-hmm.
The Tomahawk missile.
That's right.
We were sitting on a cache of Tomahawk missiles. We had to get rid of them because the only way we can order more is if we use the ones we got.
That's right.
So Barack Obama was like, well, we're going to fire Tomahawk missiles against strategic points, trying to mitigate civilian casualties. Blah, 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 blah. I'm like, no, that's not why. You don't care.
Right.
And it frustrates the hell out of me that people don't see that. I mean, I mean,
well, they
not the tomahawks, but the drone missile attacks on innocent civilians.
90% of them were innocent civilians.
Yeah.
90%. Well, and that's the thing when Trump dropped the mother of all bombs, which the term has all kinds of, fuck you, Islam all over it. But that was the largest non-nuclear weapon in history that Bush bought in 2004. Cost $300 million, that one bomb. Right. So it's sitting around. Well, we got to buy another one. So what do you do? Well, let's drop this one. And they guaranteed that, it was only we only got the bad guys. 2-mile blast radius, but we only got the bad guys, right?
I talked to a drone operator about I said, when we're trying to mitigate casualties, I said, we're using satellite photography. So we have, of course, facial recognition. So because we have to confirm our targets.
Right.
That's just a rule. You can't shoot till you confirm you have a target.
Right.
Do you know they will pull the trigger only after they have 70% assurity that they have the right target?
Wow.
You can be 30% wrong and still pull the trigger.
Wow. That's scary.
Yeah.
And and then we've gotten better. Like our death tolls have gone down with every war because we've gotten better at just the technical stuff, but we still kill millions of civilians. Korea and Vietnam alone, we killed 6 million civilians total. Right. Yeah. And so you look at, but nobody gives a shit about them. We care about the 50,000, 57,000 Americans that got killed in Vietnam, but we killed 6 million civilians. That's its own Holocaust right there.
Exactly.
And no one says anything. Right. And even this last, start wrapping up here in a couple minutes, but even this last presidential cycle, except for Tulsi Gabbard, there was not one candidate that talked about the wars. Even Bernie Sanders this time around didn't talk about wars. Nobody talked about getting out of them. Nobody talked about the fact that we were in them, that we've been going on 20 years of this shit. It's just
Sanders' campaign only argument was, how do we support the troops that have already been wounded in conflict? How do we support them after the fact? Because that's completely, we're way behind the power curve on being able to support the people that we send off to war.
Right.
Me, this is my futurist, utopian society. I run the planet. Is that war is obsolete.
Right.
Is that it only serves a very few people that have financial interests in continuing to perpetuate wars. It's absolutely we recognize it. As soon as Saddam Hussein died, we got in, or I'm sorry, even before that, when they created post 9/11, there was a perpetual war against terrorism.
Right.
They even call it the global war on terror. It's a real thing. So it still exists today. The challenge is that the war is one you'll never win or lose.
That's right.
It'll just perpetuate itself in perpetuity till the end of the planet, because terrorism is always going to exist. Terrorism existed at the beginning of civilization.
Well, and that's the thing, is it's like the war on like the war on dandruff. It's the war on an idea. It's like you don't have a return address, you don't have a country to go after, and and look who we're going after, guys who don't even have boats or planes.
Exactly.
Hezbollah. Well, okay, for a bunch of guys without boats or planes, if it wasn't for them, Israel would have annexed Lebanon by now, right? Yeah. So, they're terrorists. Well, you ever see the IDF? Yeah. That knee move that Derek Chauvin employed, that's an Israeli move, by the way. And we have our cops train in Israel, Houston PD, LAPD, and YPD. I had an Israeli pro-Palestinian activist on a few weeks back who was in the army, about my age, and had his, no pun intended, come to Jesus in the middle of the desert in 1982 in Lebanon when Sabra and Shatila went down. Mm-hmm. So he's well-versed in this shit. And we talked about our cops training over there and kind of going, all right, well, man, listen, appreciate you coming on. Gonna have to start wrapping it up. But folks, my guest has been Chris Ward. And hopefully you enjoyed the conversation. Again, you can visit us on all the usual suspects, Podcast Addict, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, doodah. And visit patreon.com/The Bitter Truth. There's always articles there as well for the patrons. And again, guys, if this stuff makes you uncomfortable, it's supposed to. Sleep tight.